welcome everybody on Veterans Day. I'm Bob Paquette. I am a 37-year veteran of Hamilton College, teaching the history department. I am also executive director and president-elect of the Alexander Hamilton Institute. The Alexander Hamilton Institute Undergraduate Fellows Program, which I supervise, is responsible for bringing you this annual Veterans Day event. Before I introduce my good friend Ted Eismeyer, who will in turn introduce tonight's featured speaker, I'm going to indulge what I think I do best in giving you a little history. As some of you know, Alexander Hamilton excelled not only as a political thinker and financial genius, but as a military commander as well. War has a way of recognizing merit. During the American Revolution, for this bastard child of a mother who was jailed for whoring, Hamilton designed battlefield strategy and led soldiers into combat. Barely out of his teenage years, he raised a company of New York State artillery and became its captain. He and his unit joined the Continental Army and fought in several engagements near New York City. He led troops at the battles of Trenton and Princeton. His precocious abilities caught the eye of General George Washington, and Hamilton was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He served as Washington's aide-de-camp, and at the decisive Battle of Yorktown, Hamilton commanded a battalion that courageously assaulted and captured a British stronghold known as Redoubt No. 10. Today, November 11th, Veterans Day, calls upon us to honor the men like Washington and Hamilton and the women who in the 200+ years since the start of the American Revolution have served in America's armed forces and shed their blood in defense of that great experiment in Republican government, which Alexander Hamilton did so much to preserve and enable to flourish. In my view, it is no exaggeration to say that personal freedom, and here I quote, the need to secure it, the obligation to preserve it, the necessity to defend it, the resolution to die for it, remains the great theme of our time. Let me be perfectly clear. Nothing could be more foolish than to think that perfect freedom is possible for human beings. But it is even more foolhardy to think that the expansive sphere of personal freedom for which the founders fought, and which everybody on this campus, whether they like it or not, enjoys, can be maintained in this or any other society without the willingness of its citizenry to be educated and vigilant in its defense. Veterans Day honors American veterans of all wars. The commemorative holiday grew out of the end of World War I and the armistice that called a halt to the hostilities signed in 1918 on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Veterans Day succeeded Armistice Day. It recognized the obvious, that World War I was not, as many had hoped, the war to end all wars. And so in 1954, after World War II and the Korean War, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law congressional legislation that traded the name Armistice Day for Veterans Day and broadened the purpose of the commemoration. In 2013, the Alexander Hamilton Institute inaugurated an annual Veterans Day lecture to honor Lieutenant General Josiah Bunting III. General Bunting is a charter member of the Alexander Hamilton Institute's Board of Directors, and simply put, He has one of the most distinguished resumes I have ever seen. A graduate of VMI, Virginia Military Institute, he received a Rhodes Scholarship and studied at Oxford University. During active duty with the United States Army, he served in the United States Army in Vietnam, receiving numerous decorations, including a Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal, and Vietnam Honor Medal. He taught history at West Point and at the Naval War College. He became president of Briarcliff College, president of Hampton-Sydney College, and superintendent of VMI. In his spare time, General Bunting published 4 novels, one that was selected by Time magazine as one of the, quote, 10 best novels of 1973. He has published a biography of Ulysses S. Grant, several other works of nonfiction, and has been working for years on a magisterial biography of General George Marshall. Our speaker this evening also has the most distinguished record of accomplishment. To introduce him, I now turn to Ted Eismeyer, Emeritus Professor of Government of Hamilton College. A truly, and I don't exaggerate here one bit, a truly legendary teacher. He taught here for about 3 decades, and he was someone on whom I always relied for good counsel. He runs an AHI Facebook page that has about 1,000 friends, and I kid you, about 1,000 friends, many of them his former students. Without him, the establishment of the Alexander Hamilton Institute would have proved a far more difficult task. So with that, Professor Eismeyer, could you come forward and introduce our distinguished guest?
Thank you very much, Bob. It's a pleasure to be back here. This is the first time that I've been here since 2012. I didn't realize it when I was teaching here, but I discovered after I retired that Clinton, New York isn't one of those places you just happen to pass by unless you're on your way to Buffalo, so I haven't been back here since. But Bob offered me a deal I couldn't refuse, and that is to introduce to you Sam Bowlby. I'm also delighted to welcome some members of the Hamilton football team here tonight, fresh upon their taming, note the word taming, of the Bates Bobcats 38-13. So congratulations to the football team. Before I introduce Sam, I want to salute Bob Paquette, who is retiring after this semester after teaching at Hamilton for 37 years to devote all of his prodigious energies to the Alexander Hamilton Institute. For almost 40 years, Bob has been the model of what a Hamilton professor should be, a nationally recognized scholar of slavery, the driving force behind the Alexander Hamilton Institute, and most importantly, a challenging and caring teacher. Bob has spent many gallons of ink helping Hamilton students become better writers, and many thousands of hours helping them become better thinkers, citizens, and people. Bob, I salute you for your career at Hamilton, and I salute you and Zoya for your partnership in leading the Alexander Hamilton Institute. And I have some good news for you from the land of retirement. You will quickly forget faculty meetings. You will quickly forget department meetings. What you will remember are students. I have many fond memories of the classroom and the Washington program. But my most vivid memories of Hamilton are conversations with students in my office, often having nothing to do with courses. And one of those memories is about Sam Bowlby. Sam, as you may know, is one of Hamilton's greatest football players, but he played at Hamilton at a time when there were very few wins and very high attrition. Near the end of his junior year, Sam was in my office, and I happened to ask him what he thought the prospects were for the next season, and he said, "Not good." And then I said, "It must be difficult to play under those circumstances." And Sam said, and I still remember this very vividly, he said, "I'm not really playing for myself. I'm playing for the younger members of my team and for the future players." That's a memory of Hamilton that I'll never forget, and I think it also speaks volumes about Sam and what he's gone on to do. I learned in preparing this introduction that he is indeed a Renaissance man. He majored in government and theater at Hamilton. He played the role of Lord Capulet in Romeo and Juliet. He was the captain of the football team, played on the hockey team and golf teams, and he once sang the Hamilton fight song, which I don't know, in front of thousands of people in the field house. After Hamilton, Sam served for 4 years in the United States Marine Corps. He was an infantry platoon commander in Karma, Iraq, and then a company executive officer in the Fallujah Peninsula of Iraq. Sam was awarded the Navy and Marines Achievement Award for Combat Valor and the Navy and Marines Commendation Award. Sam then went on to receive his MBA from the Olin School of Business at Babson and has worked as a field operations specialist for Google, a project engineer for Suffolk Construction, and currently works for Bridgewater Associates, which manages $160 billion in assets for 350 of the world's largest institutional clients. Tonight, Sam will speak about leaving your comfort zone, the ongoing battle to challenge yourself and maximize your potential. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce Sam.
Good evening, folks. I want to congratulate the guys and the football folks for the win yesterday. That is a bus ride that you do not want to have to end the season or to end your football career. So I'm sure that was a fun 8 hours as opposed to a silent 8 hours in the bus, which I've done, which is not fun. I just want to thank Professor Eismeyer, Professor Paquette. Thank you so much for having me. This is a tremendous honor. I did have the distinction of having Professor Eismeyer in class. I believe American Political Process. I looked for some old papers, but I was trying to dig those up. I think I do have them, much to the chagrin of my wife down in the basement, but I couldn't locate them. I wanted to see my commentary, some of the grades there. But what I do remember most vividly was how Professor Eismeyer fostered debate in his class rather than injecting a point of view. Doing so simply by asking questions, challenging the students' point of view by making them explain, and then turning it over to the students, posing the question to the rest of the class. This is the essence of debate, in my view. I never even knew what side you were on, and frankly, it didn't matter. And I really enjoyed your classes and the way that you taught them, so thank you very much for that. As I drone on up here, anybody jump in. If you have questions, if you need additional context on anything, just raise your hand, let me know. I'm more than happy to break it up before I try to put you to sleep. So, back in 2001, I was just your typical student here, worried about grades, jobs, internships, all that kind of thing, sports, relationships, blah, blah. So I was probably thinking about law school at that point. My old man had been a lawyer. I knew a ton of lawyers. It seemed like the logical, sensible, comfortable decision. But then September 11th came. Let's see if I can, how do I change the slides on here?
Use the arrow keys on the keyboard.
There we go, thank you. But then September 11th came along, and my life took a decidedly different path. I had a 9 a.m. class that morning, Vietnam Lit and Film in Benedict with Professor Thomas Bass. Keep in mind that at that point we don't have cell phones, there's no internet, no laptops in the class, so by the time the first plane hit around 8:45, we were completely in the dark. I remember getting out of class, completely oblivious to what had just transpired, but knowing something awful had happened. People were flush, confused, scared. Professors, students huddled around TVs in sheer disbelief. I walked back to South across the quad with my roommate, and we just started watching the news. Got back and saw the second tower fall. At that moment, something had changed within me. It wasn't actually for another few months or so that I started thinking about the Marine Corps. I saw a flyer on Martin's Way that the Marine OSO, the officer selection officer, was coming to Hamilton. He was on a route that hit all the schools in the area, which was customary, and we started corresponding. While my dad was in the early 60s, I never really considered the Marine Corps. I was certainly familiar with it, but he never talked about it much, not because he saw anything particularly heinous. He just didn't like talking about himself. It wasn't his way. Anyway, he got out just before they started sending folks to Vietnam, but he used to sing me the Marines hymn when I was just a little guy, something that my poor kids are suffering through now, and my voice is much worse than his. And I'll never forget rummaging through the attic one day, and I stumbled upon his sword. His Marine officer Mama Luke's sword. It was striking. I was mesmerized by it. So the Corps was definitely in the back of my mind. I just never thought that I'd actually act on it. When I told my dad that I was going through the selection process, he was apprehensive. I was somewhat taken aback then, but I get it now. He knew what going in meant. At that point, we knew the details behind the attack, especially when I told him that I wanted to be an infantry officer. Now, this was pretty bold on my part, being bold enough to think that I could actually do this. Join the Marine Corps, be a platoon commander, be in the infantry, lead young Marines in combat. Where in the hell did I get off thinking I'm capable of this? But then I remembered that I played football in the NESCAC. I can accomplish anything. But I did start to realize at that point that if I wanted to accomplish anything meaningful, that it meant pushing boundaries and leaving my comfort zone. So something clicked around that point. I started to embrace challenges more. I was a government major, but I was pretty involved in theater, eventually becoming a minor. I'd always loved it, even going back to middle school. My sixth grade performance as Judd in Oklahoma still has people buzzing at Hampton Hall Country Day School. I had been in some other plays here and there, but it was tough because I was playing football, hockey, and of course the real test of virility, golf. There wasn't much time for extracurriculars, or so I thought. So I started taking theater classes here with Mark Cryer, first couple of them, stage performance 1 and 2, and absolutely loved it. So when Professor Cryer, when he wasn't moaning about his Vikings, told me that he wanted me to audition for the main stage production, Romeo and Juliet, I was hesitant. During football season, I wanted to do it, but I was worried, stressed about not having enough time to study. What if my grades suffer? What if I'm tired? What if I forget my lines? Blah, blah, blah. But we keep talking about it. And if we could make it logistically possible, given the rehearsal schedule combined with practice, maybe we could do this. And once we decided we could, I made the decision to do it, and thankfully I accepted it. If I had passed on that opportunity, what a regret that it would have been. That experience was as meaningful as any that I had up until that point, insofar as seeing how different people prepared. I shouldn't have been surprised at all, but I was for some reason. The actors took immense pride in their performances, down to obscure details. What were the motivations behind every entrance, every line, every reaction? What's my posture? Taking risks, being bold in decision-making, putting themselves in uncomfortable positions at times in order to see what worked best. I had a great deal of respect for those actors, mostly theater majors, and borrowed many of their techniques. These folks were tough too. They were very mentally tough. Inevitably, the director is going to deliver some harsh feedback. And just like in sports, there's no time to sugarcoat this kind of thing. Improvements need to be made, and they need to be made immediately. The feedback was delivered in no uncertain terms. But of course, this wasn't an attack. This is one person seeing unrealized potential in another and pushing him or her to achieve it. I saw actors in this spot many times in front of the entire cast take the notes, nod their heads, not take it personally, swallow their pride, and make those difficult changes because they knew it was crucial for the overall success of the show. It stuck with me. I started to see negative feedback and constructive criticism differently. I'd also like to thank my old defensive line coach, Pauly. He helped me grasp this concept quite a bit in my first few years on the field. I made lots of mistakes, and there was always film in a practice or a game to prove it, so I could never talk my way out of it. I used to walk off the field just cursing this man up and down. That crotchety old bastard, what the hell does he know? He's just mad, he's got no hips, his wife hates him, and he's got those damn yellow shoes. But he was obviously just trying to make me better. And I think he did. I went from a lumbering, ineffective player with no pass rush moves to a moderately effective player with slightly less lumbering moves in just 4 short years. So, Coach, thank you. You made me you made me a better player, but more importantly, a much better person, and I'm eternally grateful, Coach. Thank you. So I kept finding these similarities in theater to football. I really kind of fell in love with it and decided to stick with it. Started to get into more advanced classes and found myself doing some pretty crazy stuff. A 30-minute warm-up where you're a cat coming out of a slumber, exploring the space of your room with your voice, a whole class wearing masks without speaking, really pushing my limits, really moving me out of my comfort zone. I thought some of the exercises were more productive than others, but I always appreciated them because it really pushed me out of my zone and I did things I never thought I would do. Being uncomfortable, fighting through it. I was lucky enough to be in one more main stage play at the time, and it was out there. I had a pretty major role in it. It was avant-garde, to say the least. It was called Wipeout. Men playing women's roles and vice versa. This is one of the tamer photos. I was walking around in 13-inch heels in the first act, which they brought in from New York City. A mermaid in the second act, some sort of huckster in the third. My old man came up to see it, and afterwards he could only muster, "Well, I don't know what the hell you did, but you were pretty good." The cast was intimate, though, and we took strength from each other. We pushed ourselves. The learning was intense, and I found it exhilarating. So I want to thank Craig Luttrell for taking a chance on me. Now, when I wasn't gallivanting around stage, I was making regular trips down to Albany to see the Marine Oso. Things had been progressing well, and I was on the cusp of selection. Luckily, I was able to pull a fast one on the Navy doctor. I had had a few shoulder procedures done, and he's yanking my arm all over the place. "Do you feel any pain, son?" No, I'm all good. All good, choking back tears. Then after graduation, I was living in Martha's Vineyard with some buddies for the summer. I had to sweet talk the nice old lady at the fire station, and they gave me a good blood pressure reading. Otherwise, I might have been denied selection. This is especially difficult for me, as I'm about as capable of sweet talk as a rhinoceros. But nevertheless, I persevered and was selected. Started at OCS in Virginia, Quantico, Virginia in October 2004. So just a quick word on OCS. In the Marine Corps, enlisted folks go to San Diego or Parris Island. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Full Metal Jacket, but this is what a traditional drill instructor might look like. Looks like a nice guy. Prospective offers go down to Quantico, Virginia for about 10 weeks of boot camp for a program that focuses primarily on testing one's leadership ability, stress tolerance, and physical training. I recognized that this endeavor would be fraught with uncertainty, so now more than ever, I needed to control the controllables. And what I mean by that is, I have no idea what's going to happen when I get there. I don't know what sort of situations they're going to put me in, what people around me are going to do or not do, or how I'm going to handle it. So I can't worry about that. What I did know was that at least a third of this thing is physical, and they're going to make me do a test, pull-ups, sit-ups, 6-mile run on day 1. So I need to be as fully prepared for that as I possibly can, because this is an opportunity for me to shine. With that much time to prepare, I would have considered a complete failure if I didn't perform well in those 3 areas. I catered my workouts, diet accordingly. Agility was more important than strength at that point. No need to be 250 pounds and doing deadlifts every day. My agent had also informed me that I was unlikely to go in an NFL draft, so I let the dream die. Having played sports my whole life, it was a fairly easy mindset to adopt. I was never the biggest or the most talented kid. I didn't have the luxury to simply coast on God-given talent or ability, but I knew that I could be in control of physical conditioning, strength, endurance, particularly over the summer when there was no official conditioning program. No coaches standing behind you breathing down your back. I used to imagine some offensive lineman from Middlebury, and I'd ask myself at the end every day, did I beat him today or did he beat me? Every single day, every single training session represented an opportunity. I think about the old adage, what do you do when nobody's looking? If I had a bad day and missed a workout, I knew that I had squandered an opportunity. I felt shame, and that was a powerful motivator for me. This manner of thinking was extremely beneficial to me at OCS, and I performed well. Having an advantage over something that I could control helped give me an advantage in the areas over which I had no control. For instance, in doing some various obstacle courses that tested one's physical ability as well as one's decision-making process, I might have had a few more minutes to formulate a plan, or a couple more seconds to make a decision that other candidates didn't have. There's also the matter of staying off the drill instructor's radar. If you're lagging, you're going to become a target, and I did not want to become a target. Aside from missing the Red Sox come back from a 3-0 deficit in the 2004 ALCS, sorry for any Yankees fans out there, maybe too soon. I managed to hold my bearing, and sorry, I lost my place. Managed to hold my bearing for the most part, and graduated and accepted my commissioning as a second lieutenant. Moved on to the basic school at the end of that year. TBS is a 6-month school for all new officers in which the primary goal is to determine your military occupational specialty, or your MOS. There's probably 25 different ones: tanks, intel, artillery, public affairs, etc. Each lieutenant submits a list of her top 5 choices, which, by the way, you are guaranteed none of. You go where your skill set aligns and where the Marine Corps needs you. This 6-month course is meant to evaluate that fit. And thankfully, my efforts were rewarded. I was selected for one of the coveted spots in Infantry Officers Course, or IOC. Simply put, IOC was brutal. For much of the 3-month school, I was mentally and physically drained. Intense physical operations, grueling tests of endurance, sleep and food deprivation, etc. But it had to be that way, and I loved it. The stakes were high. We knew that we'd be on the ground fighting in Iraq within 6 months, and this was the final hurdle to clear before instructors determined if we were capable of leading Marines in combat. Any lowering of the bar was potentially putting lives at risk, in my opinion, and I was glad to see all infantry officers ensure that the attrition rate remained high. The captains who were chosen to run the school were infantry officers with combat experience, and they were the best of the best. I tried to soak up as much as I possibly could from them because I knew there was no better resource. I was also continually inspired by the other lieutenants. It's me on the second from the right, and next to that motivator with the gun up in the air, who happened to play football at Amherst, if you can believe that or not. And a good guy, actually, that went to Amherst. But I was continually inspired by the other lieutenants. We leaned on each other and continually motivated each other to keep moving forward when the situation looked bleak, and there were many of those times. After graduation, I was proud, relieved, confident, but the real challenges had not yet begun. For all Marine officers, regardless of MOS, the first time that you head out to the Fleet Marine Force and meet your platoon and address them as the platoon commander, that's a big moment. Mine was no different. There are 40-plus Marines staring at you as their direct superior for the first time, most of whom have already deployed once, if not twice. It's not easy, and it's not a moment that you can get back. If it goes poorly, which I had heard some horror stories about, you've pretty much sealed your fate, especially with Marines who generally don't remain very open-minded when it comes to newly minted second lieutenants with 0 experience. So I had some pretty serious butterflies on the way up to the barracks to make that initial address. Luckily, I held it together without making a total fool of myself, kept it short to the point. So essentially the direct opposite of what I'm doing today. Nothing profound in there, just that I was honored to be there and looking forward to the challenges ahead, that kind of thing. But I knew that I would have to earn their trust if we had any chance of being a good unit. Fortunately, we were able to start shipping at that front immediately. That was around October of '04, and we were deploying to Iraq around January '05, so the training tempo was rigorous, as you might expect. We basically head right out to the field to start training so I could get a sense of where we're at as a unit. And when I say field, I mean out in the massive training grounds of Camp Pendleton. Pendleton is located about halfway between San Diego and LA, and it's about a fifth of the size of Rhode Island. So there's plenty of space for live fire training, patrolling, defensive tactics, that kind of thing. And we head out for about 3-4 days. I won't go too deep into the officer versus enlisted dynamic, but it's customary in this situation that the officer in charge might need to head back to the company office, which is about a 30-minute Humvee ride away, to do some work, perhaps sleep, while the senior enlisted man handles the end of the day. I was planning on staying out in the field already, but I've been monitoring the forecast, and I see that it's going to rain all night. No barracks, no tents. All you've got is your waterproof sleeping bag to get through the night. And I started to get excited. What an incredible opportunity. Now, I understand it seems obvious, but you'd be surprised at how often folks in my shoes might have found some excuse to avoid sleeping on the ground that night or slept in the back of the Humvee. So when Reveille sounded at 5:30 the next morning, and all the Marines saw me get out of my bag and start dry shaving, just as soaked and miserable as they were, I had won my first battle. I got a lot of pleasantly surprised, "Good morning, sirs," that morning. The simple yet hard to follow guiding principle, never ask someone to do something that you wouldn't do yourself, was immensely helpful then, and it still is today. This was obviously just the start as far as earning the respect of the Marines. As we progressed in the workup cycle, we started doing much more involved training exercises. We moved out to 29 Palms, a base in the middle of the Mojave Desert that's bigger than Rhode Island in terms of square miles, for combined arms training, meaning basically an assault on the target with planes, helicopters, mortar fire, heavy machine gun fire, etc. In short, it's a very detailed, comprehensive attack. In the planning process, it's imperative for me to know what I don't know. I knew I didn't have all the answers, far from it. So after coming up with a plan for the assault, I take it to the senior enlisted folks in the platoon and present it. Oh, I did it again. Sorry, I lost my spot. This is a really terrible graphic of what a platoon looks like, but essentially what you're seeing here is 3 squads of 13 Marines in each squad, a platoon commander and a platoon sergeant at the top. The platoon commander is basically a second lieutenant, such as myself, with a whopping year of like 1 year experience. The platoon sergeant's been in for 7 to 12 years. He's definitely got some deployments under his belt. He's the top enlisted man. His role is to pretty much maintain good order amongst the men and mentor the squad leaders. Then we have 3 squads, 13 Marines, with a sergeant in charge, 4 to 7 years, and that's led by a sergeant, like I said. So when I say that I take my plan to the senior enlisted folks in the platoon, I'm generally talking about the 3 sergeants and a staff sergeant. I had been trained in what the books said to do, but when it came down to actually executing the mission, I simply hadn't had that experience. So I ensured that I always sought the feedback from those that had been there before, folks that were believable. I'd say, "Sergeant Johnson, what do you think? Does this make sense? Where can we improve this?" If I don't love his plan, I'll tell him why. I'll thank him for his input and we'll move on. But if his feedback makes sense, done. We're doing it. I wasn't too proud to ask others what they thought. It would be illogical not to. And the consequences were simply too severe to let my ego take over. The Marines needed to know that I valued their opinions. They needed to know that they had ownership in the process, that they not only had a voice but a meaningful one. Asking for their detailed feedback gave me crucial insight into their thought process, which presented a lot of teaching moments. Why do you think we should do that? Not in an accusatory fashion, but in a genuine attempt to understand. And if there are flaws in the plan, we can correct them and talk about why something doesn't make sense. I tried to always stress that the mistakes were good. I wanted the Marines to embrace their mistakes just as I tried to embrace mine. The mindset needed to be that the mistake is a positive because of the learning opportunity that it presents. Let's identify what went wrong and then ensure that it doesn't happen again. The day that we weren't making mistakes would have been the day I was worried, because that would have meant that we weren't pushing ourselves. So we kept training, and inevitably we kept screwing up. The junior Marines, the squad leaders, and of course, me. Poor mission planning, poor delivery of an order, unclear statements, failing to do my job during the execution phase. And by that I mean getting sucked down into responsibilities that weren't mine. We're in the middle of some assault or raid, and there I am down in the prone, firing away at the enemy. Only problem is, that's not my job. That's what a private is supposed to be doing. I need to be worried about more higher level problems. Is each squad in the right position? As the battle shifts, do I need to alter the plan? Is there a casualty situation? Do I need to call on air support? Is there different intel? That type of thing. Don't get me wrong, there's times when you need to fire your weapon as a platoon commander, but for the most part, if I'm running low on ammo, I'm most likely guilty of job slip. These training missions were invaluable in terms of what I learned about delegation and management, and they still hold the same weight. Those 4 months of training after I got to the fleet went by in a flash. Next thing I know, I'm boarding a plane for Iraq. I'm not going to lie, I was scared. I remember calling my dad from my place in San Diego the night before we left and tearing up. I didn't want him to know that I was on the verge of tears, but I was. I was thinking about my family and friends and everything I loved, and couldn't help but being a little grim about it. Will I ever speak to my dad again? It was a tough night, but I got through it. I had to. After that, I relied on the training and tried to keep things in perspective. And remember, this is exactly where I wanted to be. This is where I worked so hard to be. And I never felt sorry for myself again. I knew there would be adversity. We were heading into a place rife with uncertainty. And that first test came quickly. We were dropped off in an old chicken factory, and I was actually responsible for the colonel banning all lieutenants in the battalion from having mustaches, because mine was absolutely heinous. I'm pretty proud of that. We get dropped off at this chicken factory that had been fortified to some degree, just outside the town of Karma, and begin what's known as a relief in place. The RIP lasts for a few days, during which time you basically try to glean as much as you can from your counterpart in the unit that's on its way out. These Marines have just been on the ground for the last 7 months, so clearly there's a lot of information to absorb. The Sheikh lives here, he's a good guy, we got hit with an IED here and here, you need to avoid this area at this type of day, that type of thing. So leadership from my platoon started to join the outgoing unit for the last few patrols. The first patrol I went on, the very first time that I left the wire, happened to be a moonless night. Pretty rough conditions. There's virtually no ambient light, so we're wearing our night vision goggles, which makes the movement a bit trickier. And of course, we were unfamiliar with the terrain. We're only heading out a few kilometers on foot to talk to somebody that might have some intel, but he didn't want to talk to us during daylight hours. About halfway there, I heard the first shot ring out and saw one of the Marines go down. He was one of my squad leaders, Sergeant Bob Betts. It was not a critical wound, thank God, but he had been shot clear through the knee. He was fine. He made a full recovery eventually, but his deployment was over. And now we were down a man, and a squad leader at that. I don't mean to seem cold-hearted, but this event reinforced the next man up mentality. Know your job, but also know the job of the man below you and the man above you, because you never know what's going to happen. And when that time comes, you need to be prepared. Throughout training, we always try to be ready for the worst-case scenario. If this happens, what do? If we didn't have a good answer, we needed to find one, because getting caught flat-footed was not an option. As such, we're always prepping the younger Marines to do the job above them, putting them in uncomfortable situations, pushing them to do more than they thought they were capable of. You don't want to give someone a fish forever, you want to teach them how to fish. So now Corporal Maxwell needed to step up and assume the squad leader role. Not that we were slipping, especially at that early point, but the night reminded me that we needed to remain vigilant at all times. And there became an ongoing fight as months went by against a new enemy, complacency. Even if we hadn't seen any action in a few weeks, and even though we were starting to feel much more comfortable in the environment, our guard needed to be eternally up, because complacency kills. In fact, one of my biggest tests didn't come in the middle of any intense operation. It was a seemingly mundane event. We had been doing a night blocking operation in which we hoped to catch a suspected bomb builder on his way out of town and had set up to intercept him along a few egress routes. The night came and went, and we were nearing the end of the op, much ado about nothing, sadly. And I was doing a routine check along the lines when I came upon a Marine who looked to be asleep at his post. Approaching closer, I noticed that it was one of my sergeants, the squad leader. This particular sergeant had always been a challenge. He was the kind of guy that was a fast talker, clever, very smooth, but in a deceptive sort of way. He was also a few years older than me and had a very confident air about him that bordered on cockiness. A few past deployments can have that unfortunate effect on a Marine. He was good at his job, don't get me wrong, but he always thought that he had the best answer and struggled in taking ownership whenever his squad made a mistake. Nothing was ever his fault. Let's just say his squad's out on a patrol. Protocol calls for radio checks every 20 minutes. Without a radio check, we have no idea if he's in engagement and needs help or not. Pretty simple process to follow. But his squad tended to go a little rogue occasionally and would be tardy with the radio checks, which is a big problem. He would blame the junior lance corporal for not doing the check. He couldn't see that it was his fault for not training his radio operator correctly or failing to hold his Marines accountable. We had had many counseling sessions leading up to this day, but I hadn't been successful in getting through to him. All things considered, I was a little intimidated by him. My first reaction was a shockingly bad one. I stopped, turned around, and started to walk away. The sun was on its way up, and the op was basically over at that point. In reality, this wasn't going to be a big deal given the circumstances. The window came and went, and the guy never showed up. The whole operation was a miss. Why upset the apple cart now? If I followed proper protocol, this was going to monopolize a lot of my time and create unnecessary stress on the platoon. This is how I was rationalizing the decision to myself, talking myself into taking the easy way out, an option that can be very tempting. Letting this go would have made me a total fraud. All that talk about setting high expectations, doing your job, doing the right thing would have just been talk. Thankfully, I came to my senses, confronted the Marine, and held him accountable for his actions. I was able to look at myself in the mirror, but more importantly, the rest of the Marines took notice of what happened that morning. That interaction made us a stronger unit moving forward, I'm sure of it. The rest of the deployment came and went. Marines griping a bit here and there about being hot, being cold. I can't eat MREs anymore, wah. I promptly reminded them of what Marines faced in Korea. Primitive gear, barely food or ammo, surrounded by thousands of enemy, and it's negative 30 degrees. That usually shut them up. There were some pretty rough stretches, to be sure, but looking back, I can't think about how fortunate we were, how lucky we were. We prepared hard, we trained hard, but I never had to write a letter to anybody's parents, something I am eternally grateful for. Upon return to the States, we get some badly needed rest and relaxation. Here's some of the guys at a Marine Corps birthday ball before moving in to the next training cycle, next deployment, and for me to start getting adjusted to my new role. Like most infantry officers, I didn't want to be stuck behind a desk in some dusty command operations center. I wanted to be out there on the ground, scout snipers, recon, whatever. Only problem was most of the first lieutenant billets, and I did get promoted to first lieutenant after returning to the States, but that's no badge of honor. The old adage in the Corps is that if you can breathe, you can get promoted to first lieutenant, and if you can speak, you can get promoted to captain. So I got out as a captain, mind you. So most of the first lieutenant billets, or the roles, didn't involve having a weapon in your hand every day. I spoke about the makeup of the platoon earlier, that terrible graphic. Luckily, I have a much worse graphic here. So we'll do the quiz right after the lecture ends, assuming that ever happens. But anyway, the point here is just to give you a basic picture of what a company and a battalion looks like. 4 platoons compose one company, about 200 Marines, which is commanded by a captain, the company commander. The captain needs to be out in the field a lot, meeting with sheikhs, imams, visiting platoons, various meetings. So there needs to be someone to run the training and the day-to-day operations. That's the company executive officer, the XO first lieutenant. That was my role for the second deployment. It wasn't the most thrilling job, but it was extremely beneficial for the long term. Working up to the deployment, I got tremendous experience in long-term planning and scheduling. was a massive list of requirements that the entire company had to fulfill, and I was responsible for ensuring that we received and competently completed all the necessary training as efficiently as possible, as well as mentoring the junior second lieutenants. I was almost relieved when we flew back over to Iraq, this time to Fallujah. In country, there was a focus move to daily operations, tracking, tasking all the Marines in the field, collecting intel, giving reports to higher headquarters, etc. This would all take place in the Command Operations Center. Here's our COC. There's maps, radios, phones everywhere. I may have taken a few liberties around the holidays. And because we were situated on the western point of the city, we had a lot of traffic coming through our checkpoints. All the units were supposed to give us some advance notice, but generals would conveniently make a habit to pop in unannounced. And given that the captain was in the field most of the time, I'd have to be ready. Luckily, the generals didn't pop in over the holidays. I don't know how my decor would have gone over with them. So I'd end up giving them the battlefield brief and answer everything I could. But there would be inevitably a question that I couldn't answer. And I had to become very familiar with 3 simple words. I don't know. BSing in general is not something that I would recommend. I'd seen it before and it wasn't pretty. Then and now, people are scared of saying, I don't know, as if not knowing the answer is a sign of weakness. I'm not advocating ignorance as a get-out-of-jail-free card. You obviously have to know all the essentials. But for those questions seemingly coming out of left field, I actually find it refreshing when someone says, I don't know. Much preferred to the long-winded BS response that is more conjecture than fact. Instead, saying, I'm not sure, let me go talk to Captain Jones, he's the expert on that, or let me do a little research and get back to you, and then actually following up. I always found that to be the more prudent course of action. Sometime during that second deployment, I decided on business school, and on our way home began mentally preparing for that next challenge. To put it mildly, I was not a math guy, and I had had very little experience up to that point with finance, accounting, basically all things Excel. This was all new to me, and it was pretty damn scary too. And I struggled with the material. Compounding the matter, my father passed unexpectedly within the first few months of school, and I hit rock bottom. He was everything to me. I wanted to quit, drop out, and go home. I had never faced adversity like this before. I didn't know what to do. So I dug deep and asked for help. A lot of help from everybody that I could. And I was only able to press on because of all the support I received. I was amazed, and I still am, by what people will do for you when you ask for help. You just have to ask. I managed to pull myself together, got an internship in between my first and second year at some hip tech company in Boston. I didn't love it, but it was still a really valuable experience because I learned what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be chained to a desk all day, and I didn't want to be involved in tech. So then I took those lessons to heart and took a job at Google. It was actually a very active ops role, which I enjoyed a lot, but after a year they wanted me to move to Zurich for about 18 months. If I were younger, I would have done it in a heartbeat. But I was just about to get engaged, and there were some cons in the role too, so I reluctantly passed. Anyway, we ended up getting married, moved out of the city into the burbs, blah, 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 such a boring story. But we ended up in southern Connecticut, and I stumbled upon this place called Bridgewater Associates, where I've been for about the past 4 years. Bridgewater is a very large hedge fund, manages like $170 billion, has 1,700 employees. A company with that size with multiple buildings spread across a few towns has a need for support folks, which is where I come in. I'm involved in logistics, operations, project management. Main aspect is managing the transportation department. Just as Google buses people in and out of San Francisco to Mountain View, we do the same from New York City to Westport. It's a very unique place in terms of the culture. Radical truth and radical transparency provide the foundation for what they call an idea meritocracy. The basic thought is to be completely open and honest with each other at all times, even if and especially when that becomes unpleasant. Every day, there are situations where I have to give and receive feedback, positive or negative. As an example, say I'm in a meeting with 8 people and give a presentation. During the presentation, the person leading the meeting, call him Bill, We'll ask questions to the room. Every person in the room has to log into a poll on their iPad or laptop. Rate Sam on a scale of 1 to 10 on synthesizing the situation. That's one of about 100 different attributes that you can be rated on. So people answer the poll and their responses, comments go right up on the screen with their name attached to it, so there's no hiding. I finish my presentation and then Bill will refer to the poll. Let's say I had mostly 3s and 4s, meaning I did a pretty poor job, but one person gave me an 8. Bill is going to head straight to that person that gave me the 8 and probe into the thought process. Ted, the consensus in the room is that Sam did a poor job, but you gave him a high grade. What did you see that no one else did? Ted will then have to explain the rating, and if Ted doesn't have a good answer as to why he gave me a good rating, he's likely to get some negative ratings on attributes like willing to touch the nerve, perceiving problems, because Ted either didn't have the courage to provide me the negative feedback directly, or he just didn't see where the presentation was lacking, neither of which is good. And by the way, these comments live forever on your baseball card, viewable to all internally. The thought is over time that you'll generate tens of thousands of these ratings called dots, which combined with some other factors will show all your strengths and weaknesses. So someone can pull up my baseball card and say, Sam's pretty good at A, B, and C, but he's not so good at X, Y, and Z. That's just a little background into the company, but I've actually found it to be very similar to the Marine Corps in a lot of ways. In the Marine Corps, we'd say, pain is weakness leaving the body. Theoretically, anything that causes pain makes you stronger, whether it be that last sprint, the last rep in the weight room, finding the last source for the paper, etc. At Bridgewater, they say pain plus reflection equals progress. Perhaps worded less severely, but the meaning is largely the same. A bunch of believable people. It's very important to keep in mind that some people are more believable than others on certain topics. All just told me that I'm bad at something that I thought I was pretty good at. That's tough feedback, and it might take a while to internalize. So I need to take some time to reflect on what I just heard and take it to heart. At that point, I can move forward and progress. That's what these loops are. You're doing well, you start to fail, you feel pain, you go down, you're down in the pit of despair as they call it, you reflect, and then you begin to progress, and you keep making loops. Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater, has described this as a series of loops. Doing well, pain, reflection, progress. That's a positive loop. But it all comes down to pain tolerance and avoiding the easy path. What I've tried to do most of my adult life is challenge myself and evolve. And that has been reinforced during my time at Bridgewater. You can lead a nice, comfortable life without really challenging yourself. That's represented by the flat line. But if you want to be great, if you want to maximize your limits, push your limits, and leave your comfort zone in order to maximize your potential, you have to push yourself. When Professor Burkett first approached me about this talk, I balked. I told him I wasn't nearly as qualified as the previous speakers. I didn't have their gravitas or their intellectual chops. It was all true, by the way. But the truth was, again, that I was scared. I'd officiated a wedding, some theater, some presentations, some legendary wedding toasts, but nothing like this. And honestly, whether this went well or not is largely immaterial. The experience of going through it and seeking counsel from people that have done this kind of thing before, asking for their best practices, getting their opinions, I already have a sense of how I could do this better next time. And down the road, when another opportunity presents itself, it's going to be a little less daunting, a little less scary. So I want to thank you all for coming here and empowering me today. And thanks to the Institute for challenging me and affording me this tremendous opportunity. Thank you. And in honor of the Marine Corps birthday, which was yesterday, I've lined up a couple new recruits. That's my daughter, Noelle, I swear it's a girl. And that's my son, Little Sam. So we got a couple more guys ready to go in. If anybody has any questions.
Sam, I was interested when you said, when you talked about leading your platoon and running your ideas ideas by the senior people.
Yep.
Would you say that you were unique in doing that, or do you think it was pretty common practice among the other leaders?
It should have been
It wasn't
commonplace.
something you were taught necessarily.
It was part of the process to seek out counsel from folks that had had experience, but unfortunately, I had heard a lot of stories of people coming up with a plan, not running it by anybody, not talking to it, and just doing it, which seemed so foolish to me that you wouldn't seek the input of people that had done this before to move forward. So I'd like to be able to tell you that never happened, and we always seek input from others before doing that, but it didn't always happen, unfortunately. And it goes down to that individual lieutenant, that individual captain, who lets his ego get in the way.
You made the distinction between what is on paper and what actually ends up happening in real life. And I'm just curious to see, like, how did you go through the process, and like to what extent does what you learn in books and what is planned on paper go into the real world, and how, and if anything's built into the plan to actually adapt for how things could shape in the uncertainty of how things end up happening.
You need to be extremely flexible. We would say that you cannot be married to your plan, because it gets thrown out the window once you get out there, and the first thing happens that you weren't prepared for. So in the books, you do your studies, you figure out what you should do according to history and according to what other smart people have said, and you know what the playbook says to do in the situation. This happens, I do X, Y, and Z. But things happen when you go out in the field and it doesn't actually turn that way. Before you even get to A, there's a crazy detour. So you need to be flexible in the moment. And when you go through the planning process, you always need to think about that worst case scenario. And you can apply that to basically any job. For me, it's easy because I do sort of operations logistics. So I'm saying, well, what if this doesn't show up? We're trying to move all these people here. What if the bus doesn't show up? What do we do? That's what I was talking about with being flat-footed. The books can tell you one thing. They can give you a good base. You take that and you bring it to the people. But the books they're not always current. And the people that you present the plan to, they're current. They know the most up-to-date information. They're out there in the field. So they might say, yeah, no, I understand that, but what we've been seeing is that this, and this happened, and then I have to say, all right, that's relevant, and that renders this point moot that I wanted to do here, so let's scratch that, and let's do this. It's just being open-minded and being flexible and ensuring that you're getting the opinions of others that are believable.
We talked a little bit about the dinner, but I think the audience would be very interested in your answer. Is what is, in your view, given your service in Iraq, the most common or most important misconception that people have about the Iraq War and American troops in the Iraq War?
I don't hear it a lot to my face, but my suspicions are that a lot of people just think it was a wasted effort, that nothing good came out of it. And by what you would see on TV, it's probably your impression a lot of the time. And I'm not saying that it went well or didn't well, but I think a lot of incredibly positive things happened. I know that just from my experience walking around and talking to the people that are normal people, farmers, villagers. Before we got there, the Taliban was kind of running roughshod over them. If they didn't like you, they would take one of your kids and you'd have a head on your front lawn. And that had happened at least twice in the limited area that I covered. And they really appreciated the fact that we were there to help end that type of thing. You know, did we find weapons of mass destruction? No, of course not. But they hated Saddam, the people that I talked to there, the people that I saw every day. He's not in power anymore. We ended a lot of the brutal slayings that were occurring there. That's one of the biggest misconceptions that I'd say. Just to see the joy on a lot of the faces of the people. I mean, I could have put 100 slides up here of, you know, smiling kids and people that were overjoyed to see us, and all the help that we tried to give them. That's what I'd say.
Sam, along the same lines, did you provide security for people to vote? Or no other
The
Marines?
voting, most of the voting, at that point, it was probably in its very early stages. And it was probably taking place in the very large cities like Baghdad. It's certainly possible that at those polling stations that there was an American presence. We never did that kind of thing. We were involved more on a training standpoint from the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army, and then chasing down various leads throughout the towns and in the villages and that kind of thing. Not as much on the voting front.
I'd like to thank you, first of all, for your service. My dad was a 21-year Navy veteran, and we went earlier today to Utica to hear Jan Scruggs, he was a Vietnam veteran who was responsible for the Vietnam War, the memorial at DC, speak. It was amazing. I have a child right now serving in the Army in Djibouti, and I just think it's so important. I teach ninth grade English here in Clinton. We just read a short story, Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy by Tim O'Brien, and my ninth graders all just wrote thank you notes to veterans expressing their gratitude that were distributed at the local dinners that they had, and I dragged my daughter against her will today to some things today because her grandfather would have appreciated. I just think, I just sense such apathy sometimes in young people today. I don't think they have an understanding sometimes or an appreciation for what people are doing because it's removed from them sometimes. And so I think that it's so important that we need to appreciate the service of people and encourage that. Today at this thing, there were a lot of people there, but you could pretty much count on both hands how many young people were there with their parents. And it really bothers me, and it's so wonderful that they brought you here because you're kind of young. And I think it's great to see someone young, speaking to young people about their experiences, so that maybe that will help with that. Because I worry sometimes that there's an underappreciation for the sacrifices that people make for their country, doing what you've done, and thank you very much. I appreciate you bringing such a valuable speaker to the area. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I mean, those very kind words. It's different with everybody. People have different thoughts of the military and what we're doing overseas. And I totally agree that there is a general lack of appreciation. I'd say, especially for the folks that went well before me, those folks really saw unspeakable things, and it's sad sort of statement about certain aspects of the culture that those people are being forgotten. They get sort of commercialized here and there, but I wonder how much of it is authentic. And it's really sad when that happens. But I have friends that are still in that talk about some of the character of the younger Marines that have come in, and they're just as dedicated and excited as the Marines have been throughout. So that kind of, I take some solace in that. But thank you for your comment.
So one of your big themes was talking about pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, and obviously did this on a really big scale with the Marines. But as an alumnus, do you have advice for students on like how we can do this on a day-to-day basis?
If something scares you a little bit, but you think it's going to make you a better, stronger person, more enticing to people in jobs, you should probably do it. Classes, if there's a class that you think that is going to be beneficial to you moving forward, when you go talk to somebody in a job interview and you talk about the classes you took and you're telling a story of what you're trying to learn, you probably want to push yourself and take that class. And I was guilty of that. There was some classes that I wish that I had taken here that would have set me up for success in a lot better fashion. And that's what I would take back here. It's not just classes. If something, it's just anything that you're a little scared of that makes you feel uncomfortable, that you think can aid you moving forward, I would just, no matter what it is, I would tell you to do it. So just like whatever your personal things are that you're a little worried about or a little scared of. Those are the things you need to focus on the most. Because those are probably, if you broke it down, one of your weaknesses is probably buried in there why you don't want to do something. So that's something you want to try to focus on and try to correct, try to get better at it. I mean, we all have weaknesses, and we just got to try to keep working at it and take those loops, experience a little bit of pain, and then think about it. Was this true about myself? Can I get better by listening to this, by doing this, or by making this decision? And then you've made a positive loop there. And believe me, I am not just spitting out the Bridgewater Kool-Aid here. I'm on record at work. Believe me, I think a lot of the things are silly, but I think a lot of it is extremely beneficial. It makes a lot of sense to me. It's very rational, and I think it really will push you in the right direction.
What's your favorite football memory here at Kennedy?
It was a pretty rough period, and my class, I think, started with like 31 guys, and it ended with 4. And that really ticked me off, that there were guys that used football to get into the school, and then got here and gave up on it and left the team to fend for themselves, basically. Wasted a spot. We're not getting that back. Some of these guys were good players, but they had to go. They had to go drinking more during the week. They had to go do whatever they were going to do, and there were a lot of those guys. I use those guys as motivation, and the guys that stayed, we had a much tighter bond because we fought through it, and we took our lumps. We took a lot of lumps, but I think my favorite memory, we won our last game here, and it was a beautiful day. It was cold. And we hadn't had a lot of wins, but to win my last game and to have that be my sign off was just it was an incredible feeling. And I also had petitioned our coach to go with the all buff unis. Murph pulled out buff pants, buff socks, buff jerseys from the early 90s. And we were already wearing buff helmets, so we were all buff. Coach, you remember that? That was unbelievable. All buff when we won the game. That was my favorite memory, and it was just for all the guys that had stuck with us on that team and paid their dues. And there were a lot of guys that shouldn't have been on the field, but it wasn't their fault. They were out there. They stuck with it, and they gave everything they had and put it on the field. A lot of these poor guys getting beat up here or there, but I immensely respected those guys. And for everybody to go out like that with a winner was just a great moment.
Would you speak about your commissioning as a officer? Specifically, to what do you pledge your loyalty?
I believe it's it's an oath to the President of the United States to serve and defend the Constitution, something along on those lines. It's a boilerplate type of thing with you get a seal and a signature on there from the President, but it's the same thing that's been around there because my old man is the same one that I do. I have them both. So that when you get commissioned after graduating, then you're officially an officer.
Constitution is the key word, I think.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely.
Do you have any more questions? One of the things we're going to do is to head back to the AHI. If you don't know, it's about a mile here. It's the biggest building in the square. You're welcome to come back and have a further conversation with Sam, Ted, and others. So I'd like to thank him for being here. It was a very moving talk, a very informative talk, and he's truly an exemplar of the best of Hamilton College.